Dzień dobry, good morning. Proszę Państwa, serdecznie witamy w Krakowie, w Manga. We welcome you in Manga Museum in Krakow. Chciałbym przedstawić teraz MBT ze Stanów. I would like to present the MBT team from US. Pamela Knight. Donna Benny. I Keith Warner. Proszę Państwa, mamy 13 krajów. We have people from, at least registered, 13 countries. So I kindly ask, poproszę o podniesienie ręki. Great Britain. Do we have people from UK? Have the right. Ireland. Ireland, welcome. Norway. Yes, Norway. Hungary. Hungary. Spain. Estonia. Austria. Sweden. And on the list we have a person from US. On the list and here in auditorium. Na liście i w auditorium. Germany. Niemcy. Belgium. Belgium. Slovakia. And Poland, Polska. Panie i Panowie, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Tom Campbell.
Thank you, Witold. First, I'd like to introduce the introducer, Witold. He is the one that made all this work. He got us to get in an airplane and fly to Poland, and he made this wonderful venue available to us and advertised enough that I guess he got all of you to get here. So, Witold, thank you. Okay, well, welcome to Krakow. We're going to focus on applications, not theory. I'm going to talk a little bit about theory because I noticed when we went through all the countries, there seems to be more people here from Poland than anywhere else. That's not surprising. But the people from Poland, I think, are mostly at the beginning of this set of concepts at MBT. So, it's the first time here. I don't ship a whole lot of books to Poland, so I'm going to give a little background to begin with, to try to bring you kind of up with the theory, and then we're going to spend most of our time talking about how that theory can be applied in your life. We'll have other people will come up this afternoon and tomorrow, and they will talk about some of the applications that they are making of this MBT theory, and you will be able to ask them questions about how they applied it and how it works. You'll see these pictures behind me. They don't have anything at all to do with what I'm talking about. They're just there to give you something to do so you don't have to look at me all the time. Okay. First, I want to talk a little bit about science. You know, what is science all about? Well, it's about discovery, discovering new and reliable information. But it's also about being open-minded and being skeptical. If you're not open-minded, then you won't discover anything new. If you're not skeptical, then what you discover won't be reliable. So you need to have both of those. Bias in science, belief in science is a problem Scientists are very committed to a belief in materialism, and they only see things through that lens. Science is really about understanding how and why our experience is the way it is. Okay, the sun comes up in the east and sets in the west, and why is that? That's our experience. That's what science is all about. But experience comes in two types. One's objective and the other is subjective. Science only deals with the objective part. And if we think about those two, the objective part is really not the important part for most of us. The subjective part is where the love is. It's where the relationships are. It's where the caring is. It's where the empathy is. It's where the things you love and the things you don't like are. All of that's subjective. It's where the beauty is. The objective world is more like just the props on the play, whereas the subjective world is like the players and their dialogue and their interaction. So science only looks at the objective. Now we have some soft sciences. What they call soft sciences are things like medicine, psychology, anthropology, economics, sociology, those sorts of things that study people. But people are not very objective. People mostly live subjective lives. So they're called soft sciences, as opposed to the hard sciences like physics and biology and chemistry. Matter of fact, a lot of people in the hard sciences would tell you that the soft sciences aren't really science because they're not objective enough. Well, in the soft sciences, they try to be objective by using statistics and probability. So yes, it's about groups of people, not so much individuals, group behavior. But it's at least one step further down that line from objectivity into the subjectivity. The soft sciences have to be as objective as possible or they do not have credibility. That's very limiting for them. Okay, finally, we'll go to the far end of this chain, which is consciousness. Consciousness, by definition, is entirely subjective and personal. It's individual. Consciousness is the one most important thing. Our choices, our experience, our reality, our life, our relationships, our loves, our hates, our emotions, all of these are subjective. And that's what consciousness is all about. It's about our choices. But consciousness is largely unstudied as science, except by just a very few individuals. Consciousness is unstudied because it's not objective, therefore not a fit subject for science. That's unfortunate, since the subjective makes up that part of our reality that's most important to us. We don't even know what consciousness is. We don't know how it works. We don't know where it comes from. We know almost nothing about it other than we think we have it. I started studying physics and studying consciousness at about the same time. So it was back in the early 70s, the late 60s. And I first got acquainted as a physicist with consciousness as a graduate student. I took a course in meditation, and I discovered just by chance that I could debug my software. Debug, this is back in the old days where software were boxes of cards. boxes were about that long, and they had like 1,000 cards in a box, and the cards had holes punched in them. That was the input-output format in those days. And in those days, you didn't just cut and try. Well, let's see if this fixes the problem, and you get another run immediately, and then you try something else. And nor did we have debug code like you have today. So getting the errors out of your code was a very difficult process because there was one computer for the entire university. That computer was brand new and a powerful one for the day, but one computer for the university meant that you got a turnaround. You got your data back after your job ran on the computer maybe once or twice a week, sometimes only once or twice in a couple of weeks. So you needed to get it right. You couldn't just try something and see if it worked, or it would take you months and months and months to debug your code. So that was a very important thing then. And I found that in a meditation state, I could visualize my code because every one of those had about 10,000 cards. Every one of those cards was a line that I wrote and a card that I punched. So I was familiar with all of them. And I just had them scroll by like on a printout. And the ones that were in error, that had problems, were red. And the good code was black. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. Let me check that out. And I did. And the ones I saw that were red were ones with errors. So that got me interested in consciousness because that shouldn't have been able to happen. It was entirely subjective, but absolutely accurate. So that started my career in consciousness, along with my career in physics. When I got out of graduate school, took a job, my boss handed me a book. It was one written by Robert Monroe, Journeys Out of the Body. And he handed this book to me and said, Tom, read this and tell me what you think. That was my first job, so I thought it was a test. I wasn't sure what the right answer was supposed to be, but I read the book and I gave my report that, well, if this is true, then wow, there's another whole dimension to consciousness, to reality that I didn't know about. And as a physicist, what we do is model reality. That's what physics is all about. But if it's not true, it's just somebody's fantasy to try to sell books. So how do you know? How can you tell whether it's true or not? So we kind of shrugged our shoulders together, and he kind of agreed that that's where he ended up as well. It turns out that Bob Monroe only lived about 45-minute drive away from where we lived, from where we worked. And arrangements was made for a group of us who had read this book to go out and see what this guy was like. Was he for real, or was he, just making this up? So we did. We went out to see Bob, and Bob turned out to be a very real, very straightforward, very honest guy. Had a mind like an engineer, though he wasn't an engineer, he was a businessman. He was a well-to-do businessman, quite wealthy. He had started the first cable company in a time in Charlottesville, Virginia. So he had this big white house on the hill overlooking, his pasture land where the horses ran with whiteboard fences and the lake. And, you can imagine it was a very expensive and plush place on about 500 acres of woods and fields. So I knew he wasn't making this up to sell books, because that would have been, not enough money to be worth his while, considering how much money he had. So Bob had just built a lab to study consciousness because he had out-of-body experiences. He didn't want to have out-of-body experiences, he just had them. It scared him to death. He thought first he was going insane. He went to see a psychiatrist who told him he didn't seem to be insane. Eventually, he relaxed and just decided to go with them and see what he could do with it. So he started exploring it and experimenting with him. And that's what his book was. It was like his journal for his exploring this out-of-body state that just happened to him. Well, he didn't want to be the strange guy that did strange things. He wanted to be more acceptable than that. He wanted this out-of-body experience to be science. He wanted it to be something that was well understood rather than something that was really strange. So he built this lab. But he didn't know what to do with it. He didn't really have a plan. It was, build it and they will come kind of a thing. So he built it, and there we were. And he looked at all of us. We were all scientists. And he said, well, any of you want to come work in my lab? Set it up. And I raised my hand real quickly. I just got out of graduate school, so I was used to raising my hand. So I raised my hand, and there I am with my hand in the air. So myself and an electrical engineer started going out to see Bob Monroe about 15 to 20 hours a week, like a half-time job. And we built equipment for his lab. We ran wires. We put in devices for measuring galvanic skin response and EEG and other things. And in about a year or so, Bob was able to teach us what he did, how to go out of body, on demand, when we wanted to. Because that was our deal with him. We would be his free scientists if he would teach us what he knew. So we'd go out, we'd work in the lab, building equipment and stuff for about 2 hours, 3 hours, and Bob would come up, then we'd get in the booths, and Bob would give us instruction and talk to us through the out-of-body process. And like I said, we did this, I guess, for the next 7 or 8 years. So it was a lot of time, half-time job for 7 or 8 years. It was a lot of hours and a lot of practice. And everything we did in the lab had to be evidential, because myself and my friend Dennis Menerick, who was the electrical engineer, neither one of us were convinced. Is this stuff real? Maybe, maybe not. We had been doing evidential things like remote viewing, healing, reading numbers that Bob would put on a blackboard in another room, reading headlines of newspapers a week or two in advance, getting into the future probable database. And the statistics said that we were really doing something real. The probability that we could get the things that we got, that we could get the answers we got just out of good guessing, was about 1 in 20,000. Well, that's pretty good. That's pretty good statistical significance. So the statistics, our intellect said, this is real. But it took me probably a couple of years before I got to where my gut said, this is real. There's a big difference between knowing something's real intellectually and getting it at the being level, where you no longer question it. And that came for me probably a couple of years in with Bob, when Dennis and I went on an out-of-body journey together. And we were in isolated booths. There were 3 isolation booths that were acoustically isolated, electromagnetically isolated, and electromagnetically shielded. And I was in booth 1 and Dennis was in booth 3, so we had an empty one between us. So we were really isolated from each other. And we met above the lab in the air in this out-of-body experience. We went places, we saw things, we talked to people, we talked to each other, and we had a microphone right by our mouth. And Bob trained us to talk as we experienced so that he would know what we were doing so that he could give us help. He couldn't help us do this if he didn't know what we were experiencing. So we had trained from the beginning to talk into a mic as we had the experiences. So Dennis and I got out of about 2 hours of this experience, came up to the control room where Bob was, and Bob had both of our tapes rewound and mounted, and he flipped both of the switches at the same time so the tapes would be in sequence. And there was Dennis and I having conversations, answering each other's questions, seeing the same things, describing the same things. It was so absolutely obvious that we were together. We had similar experience. And that was the one that finally put me over the top as far as, is this real? Actually, I was probably in a bit of a fog for the next 2 or 3 weeks, wandering around the halls where I worked saying, my God, this is real. But I eventually got over it and I no longer asked, was it real? I knew that it was. So being a physicist, I wanted to understand, how does it work? Why does it work? What is it? What are the limitations? What are the abilities? What can you do? What can't you do, and why? So I started working on that at that time, trying to come up with theory and explanation that tied everything together. And I had an advantage over others doing the same thing, and that is I could go out of body and do science there. Because at that point I was very familiar with how to get out of body and get into this larger consciousness system. And I could, do things there that were evidential and then repeat them and repeat them and repeat them till they were very consistent. And then I could change one variable and do it all again and see what change that variable made in the results. And then I'd change another variable and do it another 20 or 30 times and see what difference that made. So just by trial and error, I was able to understand some of how consciousness worked. And I couldn't have done that from the outside looking in. You could only do that from the inside. In other words, from inside this state where you are inside your consciousness. You're no longer inside your body. Okay, so that's how a nice physicist like me ended up talking about consciousness and out of body and weird things like that. So my careers in consciousness research and in physics both started at the same time in about 1972. Okay, I'm 73 years old now, so you see I've been doing this a very long time. It takes a long time. I'm a little slow. Being a left brain logical science guy, I have to keep doing things until it finally penetrates that left brain skull. So I'm probably slow at it. Okay, so I'm going to give you a very brief description of this model, this my big toe model. And this model was generated over about 35 years worth of this research that I was telling you about, going into the non-physical, changing one variable at a time, having these experiences. After doing that for 35 years, I got to the point that I thought I understood consciousness. And I was challenged to explain it to a friend of mine. And after about 5 or 6 hours, I realized that I had some fuzziness about my concepts. They really didn't hold water to a level that I needed them to. So I decided to write it down. Because when you write it down, it can't be fuzzy. Fuzzy language is obviously fuzzy. If it's not a clear sentence that makes good sense, it stands out right away. When you're just talking to people, you can be very fuzzy. They kind of get what you mean, and you kind of know what you mean, but it's not very precise, but that's okay. You get by. But writing a book requires precision. So then I started to hone this theory as I wrote it. And the writing took about 5 years. And at the end of the 5 years, I published the book. This was in 2003, in February, the My Big Toe trilogy. And it was just basically the results and conclusions of 35 years of research in consciousness and physics. I wrote the book as, thank you. I wrote the book as a theory of consciousness, really. I knew that consciousness was fundamental. From all my time at the lab with Bob, it was perfectly clear to me that consciousness was the fundamental thing, and that this physical world was a derivative of consciousness. Consciousness led, the physical world followed. The physical world had to be a subset of consciousness. So that logic I knew, and I had a lot of data points that I knew this theory had to answer. A lot of things that I had established in the non-physical, and of course all the things I knew as a physicist about the physical. And I wanted a theory that would explain all of it. So out comes this theory of consciousness, consciousness being fundamental. Then it was going to explain all the non-physical things, the paranormal things, the consciousness things, as well as set the stage for how the physical world comes out of consciousness. After probably about 2 years after they were published, I finally got a big aha moment when somebody sent me an email that was talking about a totally different subject, but it just triggered my understanding. And I realized that the same principles, the same ideas, the same concepts that I used to describe consciousness also could explain quantum mechanics, how quantum mechanics worked. I knew there was the link there, but I really didn't know the mechanism. But then I did. So I thought, wow, that's good, because as you know, then and now, quantum mechanics is not understood. Physicists call it weird science. I guess everybody calls it weird science. It has features about it that are they seem to be non-logical. They are called non-local. Things happen in quantum mechanics that are impossible to happen in a physical world. So understanding it, being able to actually derive it fundamentally, was a big deal for me, because physicists just calculate it. They know how to calculate the answer. They know that if they assume that particles are really just probability distributions, in other words, particles don't really exist. They only exist as potential particles, metaparticles, and they're represented mathematically as probability distributions. And from that knowledge, they can crank the math out on those probability distributions, and out comes the right answer. That is the right answer that predicts how a quantum mechanics experiment will turn out. So that's still the way it is. But I found the root explanation for how it works and why it works that way, why it has to be probability distributions, why it couldn't be anything else. So I started looking around then. I said, well, if I got quantum mechanics, what's the other big gun in physics is relativity. And that was even easier. That only took me about 3 days to understand the big secret behind relativity. See, relativity also has this thing that nobody understands, and that is that the speed of light is a constant. In all the physical world, there's nothing else that just has a constant speed. Everything else, the velocities are additive. In other words, if I'm riding in a car at 10 miles an hour and I put my hand out the window with a ball and I throw the ball in the forward direction of the car at another 10 miles an hour, then the ball is going 20 miles an hour relative to the ground. Velocities add, not light. If you have a light source, a flashlight, going 100,000 miles an hour, and you turn the light on, the light that comes from that light source is still going the same velocity. Velocities don't add. No matter what the source of the light's doing, light always goes the same speed. That is the core concept that enabled Einstein to first develop relativity. Just that idea. From that simple fact, which of course with Einstein it was an assumption, it wasn't a fact yet, he did a little bit of algebra, it wasn't even very complex, and came up with special relativity. Special relativity has some weird things about it, just like quantum mechanics has some weird things. In special relativity, the faster you go, the slower time goes by. The faster you go, the shorter you get. Your dimensionality shrinks in the direction of the motion. The faster you go, the more massy you get. You have more and more and more mass until you get all the way to the speed of light, where time stands still, your mass is infinite, you see, and your dimension has shrunk to zero. All very strange things. And of course, at the time, nobody believed that could possibly be true until they actually were able to put very sensitive clocks into airplanes and then into satellites and move them at high speeds and bring them back. And sure enough, they were off. They had lost time compared to another timepiece that they were synchronized perfectly. So, and they lost the amount of time that was exactly what the theory predicted. And then pretty soon, the length contraction and the added mass, those things were done in experiments too, and found out that Einstein was right. All of those things do happen in our world. So that's another bit of strange science. And as it turns out, that's an easy thing to understand. If you see this reality as information-based. An information-based reality is a reality that is computed. A computed reality is what we call a virtual reality. All virtual realities have speed limits. That is, you can only, well, let me back up a little bit. Virtual realities that are dynamic, where things move, are created with a time loop on the outside of the code that runs the simulation. What that means is that you compute the state of everything now, then you raise time, one little delta t, so you make it a second more, then you recompute everything, and then you let time go a second more, you recompute everything. You keep doing that, and if your times that you do that are, let's say, only 1/30th of a second, you recompute everything, it looks just like real life. It's smooth, you know, the motion isn't jerky. So that's how you get motion, is by increasing time in a simulation. Okay, so every simulation has a delta t that is its smallest time unit. And every simulation has its pixel size, right? Its smallest dimensions. Well, the speed limit of any simulation is that delta, that smallest delta x in distance divided by that smallest delta t. That means you can only move one pixel every cycle, right? That's how you get motion, time cycle. So every cycle you can move a pixel. That's the speed limit. So all virtual realities have an upper speed limit by which nothing can go any faster than that. To go faster than that, you'd have to teleport. You'd have to move a couple of pixels in one delta t. Well, that then wouldn't be a contiguous kind of a reality. That would be where things jump around through space. They disappear here and reappear someplace else. So that's not the kind of reality we have. Okay, so that was then why c is a constant. C basically represents the resolution of our virtual reality. Resolution means the smallest, you know, what are the smallest pieces of it? So it's a quantum of distance divided by a quantum of time. That's what c is. Then I found out that the speed of light, though it's supposed to be constant, really wasn't. That over the last 100 years, maybe, as long as we've been able to measure these things, the speed of light seems to have changed a little bit. Not all the time and not randomly, but it would tend to get a little bigger or a little smaller out in the 8th or 9th decimal place, you know, not much, just a teeny little bit. And the difference was greater than the measurement error, so they knew that it was a real difference. And that was very puzzling. And the reason that happens is because in a virtual reality, you have this resolution, and you don't make the resolution any smaller, no more precise than you need it. Because the smaller the resolution, the more computation you have, right? The more trouble it is for the computer to run it. If you have tinier things, it has to do a lot more calculation to move something. So, as we got our science ideas together, we, players of this virtual reality, we started to dig deeper and deeper into smaller and smaller things. And when we did that, the resolution of our virtual reality needed to be increased. We needed more tiny descriptions of things. But we don't want to change the velocity of light because that's a pretty fundamental constant, and a lot of things depend on that being that way. Well, how could you fix this problem? How can you change the resolution so we can look at tinier and tinier things without changing the speed of light? Well, you just change the delta t and the delta x by the same amount. And the ratio, the speed of light, is constant. But these things are digital. It's a delta t and a delta x. You can't just change them by any amount you want. They only can change by that delta. See? So it's impossible to keep the ratio exactly the same because they're digital. They're not analog. You can't take a pixel and divide it by 3, and now you have a third of a pixel. You can't put anything. You can't put a pixel, a third of a pixel over. Everything has to move by a whole unit. So anyway, that's why in the 8th or 9th decimal place, the speed of light seems to wiggle around a little bit as the resolution had to be raised because we keep digging deeper and deeper. It makes a good explanation of that very mysterious fact. And so I went on with all of the, we call them paradoxes in physics, and some of the paradoxes in philosophy, and paradoxes in metaphysics. And every one of them had a solution, just like why are particles really probability distribution? Why is the speed of light constant? Why did the speed of light dither around a little? All of these paradoxes had good, solid, logical answers, which gave me a warm, fuzzy feeling that the virtual reality concept was a good one. Okay, so here's kind of the story, the storyline of MBT. And I'm going to just jump over it quickly, though it's going to sound like I'm just making it up, and I'm just making statements with nothing to back them up. There really is logic and good science backing all these up, but you'd have to read the book. We don't have enough time here to go through all of that detail. So I start with the fundamental in our reality is consciousness. It's what I call the larger consciousness system. Okay, and we are parts of that system. Each of you and I, we're all pieces of that larger conscious system. And I call those pieces individuated units of consciousness. So that's us. This larger consciousness system evolved. It didn't just start being what it is. It started as something very primitive. And I can give you a hand-waving story about its origin and where it came from, but I can't give you a complete good theory of that because beginnings are always problematical. And it's not that we just don't know, but there are things that we can't know. Beginnings are problematical because the beginning of something, that something wasn't there to see its beginning because it wasn't there until after it began. You see, there's this logic problem with beginnings. So we didn't watch ourselves be born when we were born because we hadn't been born yet. Biologists run into this with the first cell. Give them a cell and they will let evolution create all the plants and animals here. But where did that first cell come from? Physicists have a similar problem. You give them a ball of plasma and they'll tell you about the Big Bang theory of how that plasma evolved, but where did that ball of plasma come from? Now I can answer both of those about the cell and the ball of plasma, but in any case, it's still true that the beginnings are problematical. We can't see the beginning of the consciousness system because we are part of the consciousness system. So we can't get outside the system in order to look back at it objectively and see how it began. So we're kind of stuck here without being able to get outside of what we are. So the actual origin of consciousness is one of my assumptions. Just assume that consciousness exists, which isn't too crazy because, you know, most of us probably feel like we're conscious most of the time. So consciousness exists as an assumption. But I can take it back to the point where it was very simple, okay, where consciousness was nothing more than a very vague awareness that something existed and that it could exist this way or that way, that there was change. It could feel a difference. It could perceive a difference in its state of being. Well, that's all you need. That's a consciousness, and those two states are binary. It's a 1 and a 0, if you like. State 1, state 0, state A, state B. And from there, all you have to do is multiply to where you have lots of states and lots of 1s and lots of 0s. And what you end up with is an information system. Now, consciousness then is an information system. Information is created with order. If you have a lot of random bits, all the bits are random, there's no information. Okay? If the bits are ordered, then you have information. Just in the ordering, you have information. Up, down, what's next? Up, right? How'd you know that? Well, because the pattern contained information. So the pattern was an ordered thing. We measure order in physics by a term called entropy. If you have high entropy, that means you have a lot of disorder. Entropy is a measure of disorder. So all the bits are random. That's as high entropy as a system can be. Order those bits, you create information, and the entropy is lowered because now you have order. So order, lower, and lower entropy go together. Chaos and randomness and high entropy go together. Okay, so we have an information system called consciousness. This information system, in order to survive, in other words, in order to keep its information, has to evolve. It evolves by lowering its entropy, creating more order, more information. If it de-evolves, it ends up with random bits, and now it's not an information system anymore because there isn't any information. So information systems evolve by lowering their entropy. It's a key point. They have to continually change in ways that creates more meaningful, more useful order. So that's what consciousness is, an information system. This information continued to evolve into new possibilities until its evolution slowed down because it was just one monolithic thing. And it only had so much possibility, so much potential as one monolithic thing. It did have a couple of neat technologies that it had created. One, of course, were patterns. Others were patterns of patterns, and it could do that, you know, as deep, take the patterns as deep as it wanted. Another thing that it invented was time, because now you can have sequences of patterns. So it just gave you another way by which you could order things with sequences. And what is time? Time is change. Time is one of those, there's a couple of those cells going 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. That's a clock. That's a metronome. That created the ability to sequence. So it had those technologies, and it had free will. We'll talk a little more about free will later, but it has to have free will, because otherwise, without free will, there's no choice. And we've already talked about a lot of choices. It evolves rather than de-evolves. It needs new technology, so there's a richer environment in which it can evolve into. So it has to have choice. And if the choice is not free, then it really isn't a choice. So you either have free will or there are no choices. If there is no choices, there's nothing happening within consciousness. So we'll find out and talk about it later that consciousness requires free will, time. Okay, those are two things. You can't have change. You can't evolve without time. Okay, so the time gave it an ability to change, keep track of its change, and keep track of its entropy going up or down, and so on. Evolution. All right, so its evolution started to slow down, and when that happened, it came up with a very clever idea. Our biology did the same thing, and that's partly because this is a fractal system. And what its idea was, is that it would split pieces of itself off to be independent pieces of consciousness, also with free will. And now those two things could interact with each other. But because they both had free will, there was a whole lot of new configurations that it might take place. So many that you didn't really know what they all could be. And then it did again and again and again, and pretty soon there's hundreds of thousands of things with free will. These are the things I call an individuated unit of consciousness. These are you and I, all interacting with each other. And the idea was that through the possibilities and the potential of all that interaction, it could then create more information, more value. So now its evolution started to speed up again. So we have kind of the creation of us. Okay, but now let's get to the creation of our physical world. Why that took place. Evolution found that progress was slow. It found, well, I'm going to back up and say something else first. It found out that it had a social system. All these individual units of consciousness comprise a social system. And by trial and error, it discovered, this larger consciousness system discovered, that the way to lower entropy, the way to optimize interactions for the most order, the most construction, the most complexity, was if all the pieces cooperated, worked together, and that a way that was very inefficient for lowering entropy was if every individual unit of consciousness did its own thing in its own way for its own reasons. That did not build, more structures. It didn't optimize what the whole system could do. So, I'll skip the logic, but where this leads is that the purpose of a conscious system is to lower its entropy, to evolve, more complexity, more information. And to do that, the interactions have to be cooperative and caring. That's the love path, if you will. So that brings us to the idea that consciousness evolves by becoming cooperative amongst its pieces, by caring, by compassion. These are the things that helps it optimize its potential. And on the other side, we have the opposite, and that's the fear path. With fear, there's no trust. Without trust, it's hard to build anything that lasts very long. And one of the examples I give with this, I guess I can do that quickly, is that if you had a group of units of consciousness, let's say 10,000 of them, and we'll call that A, and you have another group over here, B, and the groups are pretty much identical. They all have the same attributes. And we're going to give each group a set of resources, things that it can do, things that it can work with. And then we're going to let them go and say, all right, go, B, there's your resources, and we'll come back maybe 100 years later and we'll look and see what happened. Well, this group A is the love group. They're the ones that cooperate. And the other group's the fear group. They're the ones that don't trust. Cooperate if they have to, but only until it's no longer their best advantage to cooperate, and then they quit and cooperate with somebody else. So what do you think you'd find? Well, with the love group, you'd find that in the 100 years, they would have optimized their resources for the whole group, for everyone. What they could construct and build and what they could do with their resources would be optimal. With the fear group, you'd find that in the beginning, they just didn't trust each other, but everybody was trying to get other people's stuff because they feared that somebody would get their stuff. The best thing to do to keep that from happening is be a tough guy and get their stuff first. And then they started to group up, mutual defense arrangements. So a bunch would group up here, then this group could go take stuff from all the ones that weren't grouped up. And they then had to group up in defense against that group. And so these groups would appear, and these groups then would fight with each other of trying to get each other's stuff. And eventually, you'd have hierarchy building up within these groups. You would have 95% of the resources controlled by 5% of the entities. All the ones underneath were all the serfs, the peasants, if you will, who did the bidding for the people on top, because that's what you get in a lot of hierarchy, which sounds like where we live, doesn't it? That's our world. We live like the fear group. We're very fearful, and that's the kind of society we generate. But this love group is very low entropy. The fear group's very high entropy. So what does a consciousness system, what does an information system do to evolve? It becomes love. It becomes cooperative. That's what it does, because a consciousness system is a social system. So that's its purpose. So here it is now. It's got hundreds of thousands of individuated units of consciousness, and it has realized that what it needs to do is to have all of its pieces cooperate and care about each other. Well, that's kind of hard to do, because the environment they have is like a big chat room. Consciousness just communicates. That's what it does. It makes choices. It chooses what to send out and what to do with what it receives. And you can imagine if you were just a member of a big chat room with 100,000 people in the chat room and there were basically no rules. That's a hard place to evolve. That's a hard place, to get along. You can't get much traction there. There weren't enough rules. So the system realized that it needed more choices with consequences, moral choices. It needed a new environment in which the entities weren't just trading information because they could say anything and there were no consequences to whatever they said. So a virtual reality was created, and this virtual reality was created out of just two things: a rule set and initial conditions. You start with initial conditions, and then when you hit the run button, the simulation changes based on how those initial conditions change according to the rules. Okay, that's done in some of our computer science departments now in universities. They have such models that are just rule sets and initial conditions. And then they let them go. Matter of fact, one of the simplest versions of those are things called cellular automata, where you just have initial conditions and rule sets. So they change with this. That was the beginning of our virtual reality that we call the physical universe. What was the initial conditions? Oh, it was that tight, high temperature, high pressure ball of plasma. Oh, that's where that ball of plasma came from. Yes, that ball of plasma were the initial conditions for our virtual reality. So now we know where that came from. And then when the run button was hit, according to the rule set, which says our physics, our biology, our chemistry, things started to change. And as they changed, because the plasma expanded, it cooled, gravitation is in the rule set, it coalesced, you had suns, you had planets, and you have the universe, and eventually you have our solar system, and you have us. All came out of this simulation. And that simulation continued to run until it generated things, entities, beings, whatever, characters, or I guess we call them avatars, till it generated something that made choices that were interesting, moral choices, choices that mattered, choices with consequences. And when it did, and while it was developing, all the characters were being played by the computer. So those of you who are into games, those are NPCs, non-player characters. So the computer was playing all the characters itself. But once some of the characters got to the point that they made interesting choices, individuated units of consciousness like us would log on to make the choices for that avatar. You see? So then, where does that leave us? Okay, that leaves us as bodies that are avatars. We're consciousness. We're pieces of a larger conscious system, and we're playing avatars that are our physical bodies in a multiplayer game hosted by the larger consciousness system. I know, that's a lot to wrap your mind around. But it solves all of those pesky paradoxes in physics and science once you understand that. And then a lot of things begin to make sense. There's a lot of ways that you can tell whether or not you're in a virtual reality. All of those ways are things that we find here. Like one of the ways you tell that you're in a virtual reality is that your virtual reality just seemed to start out of nothing. That's when the run button was hit. So if you're an elf in World of Warcraft and you want to go back to the very first moments that World of Warcraft existed, you will find that there was nothing, and then poof, there was the World of Warcraft, and it had things running around in it, and it basically existed So it pops out of nothing, just like we did, just like that ball of plasma did, pops out of nothing. That's an indicator of a virtual reality. And there's about a dozen of these indicators that I won't go through now, but all of them indicate that this is a virtual reality. So here we are playing an avatar. And what's our purpose? To evolve our consciousness. And I call that evolving the quality of our consciousness, lowering the entropy of our consciousness. And how are we supposed to do that? Cooperation, caring, love. So now we have a purpose. We have a physical reality to play in, and there's a point for us being here. We're supposed to grow up. We're supposed to become caring about each other. That's the love path. That's the path that evolves. The path that we're in now, when we said that fear group kind of looked like us, well, that's where we are now. We're not very evolved, but we are working on it. And evolution is a slow thing. It takes a lot of time. So I know there's going to be lots of questions, and I don't have time to run through all of them. So that, you see, it has to be that way for several reasons. One, if you just look at a virtual reality, you'll see all virtual realities have to work the same way. And that is, one, it has to have a purpose. Virtual realities don't just create themselves for no reason. Nothing works like that. The real world, there has to be some point and purpose for it. Okay, we already talked about that. The virtual reality is really a conversation between a player and a computer. The computer is the server for the virtual reality. The player and the computer talk to each other and exchange data. And the player and the computer have to be in the same reality because you can't exchange data across different reality frames. Now, the player tells its character, makes all the choices for its avatar. So the player says, "Elf, stand up." Sends that data to the computer. The computer now makes the picture of the elf stand up and also computes all the consequences to that elf's action of standing up, because it's an interactive game. Okay? Then it sends that image of the elf standing up to the player. The player sees that, gets the data, and says, "Okay, my elf just stood up. Now, elf, run." Well, then it sends that command to run to the computer. The computer sends back a data stream that shows him a picture of the elf running. That's how virtual realities work. It's a data exchange between a player and a server. The actual elf and the rocks and the streams and the buildings and the monsters and all the stuff that makes up that virtual reality are just computed. They're just computed. Okay? So what that tells us is that this virtual reality is computed. Our bodies are the avatars. We are part of consciousness. Consciousness, a part of this conscious system is acting as the computer. After all, it's an information system. And a part of it is us, individual units of consciousness. And the reason that it did this is because we needed a tighter rule set, something that gave us choices with consequences, so that we could evolve the quality of our consciousness. We could lower our entropy. Well, why do we want to lower our entropy? Because for the system, it's lower your entropy or die. So I've covered a lot of ground here. I'm just jumping through this, leaving a lot of things out, but trying to get all the basics. So some interesting things about being in a virtual reality. It has some interesting properties, and I'll discuss a few of these. So what it means to be a player, playing an avatar in this virtual reality, it means, one, you have a purpose. Your life has meaning. Your purpose is to grow up, lower your entropy, evolve the quality of your consciousness, spiritual growth, whatever you might want to call it. That's your purpose. Okay? It also, you are a co-creator of this reality. And you co-create this reality in 3 different ways. One way is that you get a data stream, you have to interpret that data, and whatever interpretation you give to that data, now I mean you, the consciousness, you, the player, okay? You get a data stream from the computer, you have to interpret that data. What does it mean? And then from that interpretation, you make choices. Well, your interpretation of that data creates your reality. Your interpretation may not actually be what was sent to you, it's just your interpretation of what was sent to you. Everybody lives in their own personal reality. It's a multiplayer game, so we interact, but everybody lives in their own personal reality. You cannot share an experience. You can describe an experience and share the description, but you can't actually share an experience. Okay? So each of us lives in our own reality, and that reality is created by our interpretation of the data we receive. Okay, now the data we receive in this reality is what we call our sense data, right? We get data that describes what we see, what we hear, what we feel, what we taste, what we smell. That's the data we get, and we interpret that data, and we interpret it to be this reality. All right, so that's one way we co-create, is through our interpretation. That's what makes each of us unique, living in our own unique reality. Another way that we create our own reality is this is a very interactive place. So if you are a very nice, caring person, people like you, they like to be around you, you have a lot of friends, life is good, you smile a lot. If you are, say, a user of people, you just, what is in it for me? What can you do for me? A kind of an attitude, and you just use people, well, then people don't like you, they tend to leave you alone, and you have a completely different viewpoint of life. You live in a very negative space instead of a positive space. So that creates a different reality for you. So how you interact is another way you create your own reality. And the last and most interesting way is with intent. Your intent modifies future probability. For that I'll have to give you a little more description. In order for this virtual reality to function, it has kind of the mechanics of it. It requires a way for the system to give us when we measure things, the system gives us data. So the way that works is if I do something, say there's a drawer here and I pull out a drawer and look and see what's in it. As soon as I pull out the drawer and look, that's a measurement. And the system has to send me data to show me what's in that drawer, if anything. So my action of pulling open a door, making the measurement, forces the system to send me a response. Okay, now if there's only one thing that could be there, then the system just sends me that. But a lot of times, there's a dozen things that might be in that drawer. And any of them would be as good an answer as any of the others. Okay? It has only 2 rules about what it can put in that drawer. One, it has to be consistent with everything that's gone before. It has to be consistent with history. 2, it has to not violate the rule set. But those are the only 2 things. Okay? So if there's nobody alive in the world today with any information about what's in the drawer, whoever put things in the drawer of this thing has been long gone, they're dead and whatever, and nobody's ever looked since then, and so on. We'll just create this imaginary idea. Then there is no information available. The system can put anything at all it wants in that drawer, and it would still be okay. It wouldn't conflict with any of those 2 rules. It wouldn't conflict with history, as long as it was something that could be in the drawer, and it wouldn't reflect with the rule set as long as it was something that the rule set supported. So now there's lots of things that might go in there. And how does the system decide what to put in there? It does it with a random draw from the probability distribution of the possibilities. Now that's a mouthful, but it looks at all the possibilities. And it looks at all those possibilities, and some of those possibilities are more likely than others. Okay? So it takes all the probabilities into account, does this random draw from the probability distribution. That's not a random draw from all the possibilities. It's the probability distribution, and what that means is that things are more likely, things that are more probable are the ones that are more likely to be picked. We can go into more detail with that if you like to. So that's how it does that. Now, how does that work in our world? Let's say that we have a scientist who has the brand new, best telescope ever invented, and nobody's really used it yet, and he looks into a part of space and sees things that have never been seen before. Well, when he looks into that segment of space deeper and farther than anybody's ever seen before, there's maybe thousands of things that could be there. But they all would have to be in consonance with the stuff that we know generally is in space, and with the stuff that we know that was kind of around that area there before. It can't be something different. He's not going to look in there and find a chorus line of dancing hippos or something that just doesn't make any sense for being in space. He's got to find something that fits the history, and it has to be within the rule set. But a random draw is taken from all of those possibilities and all of their probabilities, and that's what he sees. And now that he sees it, and he's taken his picture of it, it becomes a fact. And now anybody else that looks at that same spot has to see that thing. It's become now part of a history, part of our history. It's a fact. So that's the way the system works. In order for the system to work that way, it has to keep a running log, if you will, of all the possibilities and all the probabilities of the possibilities. So it does that. So it starts with just the next delta t. So we're in this delta t. Remember, that's a small unit of time that we run to make the simulation active and go. So it says, what's likely to happen in the next delta t? Well, that's pretty easy because our delta t is like 10 to the minus 44 seconds, and not a whole lot's going to go on in 10 to the minus 44 seconds. So that's an easy guess. And then it says, if that's true, if we guessed right there, then what would happen in the next delta t and the next? And we can do that just as far out as we want to go. The further out you go, the rattier the data gets because you're packing all these assumptions up that the last one was right. But so it has this database. The database I call the probable future database. So it's everything that could possibly happen and the probability that it might happen. So it just keeps running tabs on that. So we have that database. So that's this future probability that I was talking about when I said the third way that you can modify your own reality is with intent. With your intent, you can change the probabilities in that future probable database. So let's say there was two possibilities, and one of them was, let's say a 0.4 and a 0.6. And you could have your intent for the 0.4 to be the one that is going to manifest in the present. And if you keep working your intent on that, those things will change. Now the 0.4 goes up. Now maybe it's a 0.8 with your intent. Doesn't mean it'll happen. It just means it's more likely to happen. Now let's say you had something that was a probability of 1 in 100,000. And you work real hard, and you're a master wizard, and your intent is powerful, and the force is with you, and you change it from 1 in 100,000 all the way down to 1 in 10,000. wow, that's a lot of change because you're such a wizard, but it's still very unlikely. It isn't going to happen. So it's not that you get whatever you want, it's that you modify the probability of what's going to happen. That's all. Sometimes you can't make a difference because the probabilities are too big to change, okay? Too different to change. You can't make that much change. So we get to do that, modify future probability. And once you understand that, there's a whole lot of things that then make sense, like the placebo effect. The placebo effect is just a person changing the probability of their health based on information, right? To give the patient a sugar pill or a sawdust pill, and the patient takes it, and they tell the patient, this is a wonderful new medicine. You know, it just comes out. Everybody that takes it gets healed. So you take it, you have a positive attitude. That positive attitude helps bias the probabilities to a positive outcome for your health. Okay. This is how we heal with our minds. We change the future probability of an individual having better health. This is how we move the odds in our favor that when we have our family picnic, it's not going to rain. Because you have a whole lot of people saying, I want a sunny, nice day. And that actually changes the probabilities. Okay? But there's some farmer who has dry crops and he's saying, I really want it to rain. So that's going to fight with your probability, and you end up with the collection of all the people for all the things that their intents are for, and it all kind of washes out, and what happens, happens. So again, you can't always have it your way, because there's others who may want to have it the opposite way. Okay, you've probably heard of the law of attraction. That's how the law of attraction works. You modify future probability with your intent. And the reason we have this ability to do that is that the system has given us this virtual reality as a schoolhouse, right? This virtual reality is an entropy reduction trainer for individuated units of consciousness. We're here to grow up. Okay, well, a schoolhouse is more effective if you give the students feedback. How are we doing? Right? The teacher does that by giving you a test and then giving you a grade on the test. Well, we, humanity, have created this reality that we're in. If you look around and you see the world, you see all its dysfunction, you see the nastiness, you see the greed, you see the self-centeredness, you see the harshness. That is a very accurate representation of the quality of consciousness of the human race. That's who we are. So that's our feedback. You know, feedback comes kind of classically in the role of two things, and that's sticks and carrots. If you want to make your mule move, you either give them a carrot, a reward, something nice to get them to go forward, or you use a stick to give them punishment for not going forward. So life is like that, and our reality is like that as well. So if we play this game well, we evolve, we become cooperative and caring and compassionate with other people. The game works out great for us. We're happy, we're positive, our life is full of joy, and we're winners in this game. If, on the other hand, we are up to our eyebrows in fear, we're self-centered, it's all about us, well, we have a lot of struggle, pain, misery, dysfunction, dissatisfaction. That's just the way the game is played, you see. That's the stick. Your dissatisfaction and your pain is the stick you get for being self-centered. And your joy and your happiness is the carrot you get for not being self-centered, for being caring. So that using your intent to modify future probability is a very powerful thing. And not only do you have placebo effects, but you have lots of other things that you do all the time with this. You know, people who are positive and happy and upbeat tend to have pretty nice lives that get along pretty well, and people who are miserable, full of self-pity, oh, woe is me, you know, everything goes wrong, they tend to have a life where everything goes wrong because they're putting energy into that. Okay. So that gives you a kind of an initial run over the general concepts and philosophy of my big toe. So we're going to try to focus more on applications. It's nice to have the company now of a lot of other physicists who agree with me that virtual reality is a good idea and a good theory. When I first published the books in 2003, myself and maybe 3 other people on the planet thought that virtual reality was a sane idea, and everybody else thought it was ridiculous. But now there are lots of physicists. The concept has grown tremendously. And all the major physics departments all around the world will have physicists that think virtual reality is the right answer. And it's not because of my work that's done that, it's because their own experiments, science, particularly quantum mechanics experiments, have kind of drug physicists kicking and screaming into the realization that this being a virtual reality is really the only concept that works, that answers all the data, can explain the experiments. So virtual reality has become probably the fastest growing concept in physics over the last decade, and I don't see that slowing down. I think that's going to continue and will probably increase over the next decade. So I think it's an idea whose time has finally come because it just is better physics. It answers the mail and explains the experiments better than any other concept. So I'm not so alone out there anymore on the fringe. Probably in another 4 or 5 years, I'll even be more centrist instead of fringe at all, as virtual reality ideas grow inside the scientific community. Okay, shift gears a little bit. The scope of your existence, kind of answering the question I asked earlier, is what does it mean to live in a virtual reality? And we said that it means you have a purpose, and as you meet that purpose, your life gets to be very positive and good, and if you struggle against that purpose, then your life tends to be hard and full of stress. But beyond that, what it means to be in a virtual reality is that you are part of something much larger. You are consciousness, you're not a body. The body grows old, the body dies, consciousness does not. You're immortal. You just get to keep working on it and working on it until you get that entropy reduced. You also have the ability to explore all of consciousness. All of the larger consciousness system is yours to move around in, to explore, to do research in, just to have fun in, if you like. You are consciousness. So there's much more to reality than just what you see here. This is just one virtual reality out of many in the larger consciousness system. And you have the ability to explore all of that reality. So it's a much bigger, it means you have a much bigger scope to your existence when you live in a VR. Your potential for growth is unlimited. You get to keep evolving the quality of your consciousness, and it just continues to get better. You don't get to a point where you quit. Sometimes people ask me, what's the end game? Where do we go? What happens when all of us have become love? Well, one, that's not likely to happen because there's always new consciousness coming in to the system. It's not like there's just N of us and eventually all N of us are going to grow up. That N keeps getting bigger and bigger. There's more and more of us all the time. But the interesting thing is about entropy is that if you don't keep working to reduce it, it starts to increase. So the minute you stop working on getting rid of your fear starts to grow. So if you get to the point where you say, all right, I'm done, I'm enlightened and I understand this, so I'm ready to quit and lie back and get a harp and sit on a nice cushy cloud and play it. That will be when you begin to de-evolve. You have to constantly keep working to lower entropy. Second law of thermodynamics. If you don't keep putting energy into the system will eventually dissipate and go away. So, unlimited growth, unlimited joy. You'll find that the paranormal, paranormal gets that name paranormal, which just means beyond normal. It's just not normal. Well, things are not normal or beyond normal basically because we don't understand them. We don't know how they work. When we don't understand something, that doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means that we're ignorant. So what you'll find as you study in this area, that the paranormal becomes normal. It's not really outside your understanding. It's just a natural part of the way our world works. Our world being the world of consciousness. We talked about that future probable database. As time goes on, as that delta T keeps tick-tocking away, what was in the future then goes through to the present, where all the choices are made in the present. That's the only active region is the present. Then the rest of it is this database. Then it goes into the past. So eventually that big future probable database goes down to the present, comes out the other side as the past database. Still has all the probabilities intact, so it's now everything that could have happened and the probability that it might have happened. And through that thread of all those things that could have happened is what actually did happen, the choices we did make, and that becomes just a thread that runs through that past database. Now that past database is one that many people like to explore. Many people like to explore the probable future as well. But things like remote viewing is just getting data out of that past database or out of the probable future database. Remember that the past starts at 10 to the minus 44 seconds after the present. So that past database really is pretty much up to date. You would confuse it with the present. So that's what remote viewing is all about. The way you get data from a database is with your intent. Your intention is the query tool. You have an intent for your data and you can get that data from a database. Your consciousness, that's a database within consciousness. Same with the probable future. All that data is available to you. When people see auras, You're getting data out of the database. It's just different data. You can get data out of the database about a person's health, about a person's emotional state, about their quality of their consciousness, pretty much whatever you like. And one of the neat things about this database is you can also specify the output format. If you'd like to see it in color pictures, and you want to choose what the colors mean, you can have it your way. If you'd like bar graphs or pie charts or line graphs, you can get the information any way that you can specify. So it's a very interesting database. You also can get into these databases and experience them in a couple of ways. One, you can experience them like you're a voyeur, just an observer, and you're watching a movie. You're watching it play out. Or you can actually get into it and be in the movie, be a character in the movie, interact with it, make choices, change things. But it's just a database. It's a database with all the various probabilities. And there's only that one thread is what we really did. So all the things that we hear about that are paranormal are really normal. They're artifacts of consciousness. Now there's some skill and some development that's required in order to access databases reliably, and we can talk some about that tomorrow, I think. We might have that conversation, but for now I just want to say that it's all just the nature of the reality of which you are part. It's not something really unusual. I want to talk about free will for a few minutes, and then we're going to do questions. Free will and time and consciousness are all logically necessary for each other. Consciousness makes choices. There are no choices if there isn't free will. There are no choices if there isn't time. Every choice has a before and an after. Before you made that choice and after you make that choice. So there's time. So those three things go together. Those three things are antithetical, the complete opposite of, incompatible with materialism and determinism. If you are a materialist, you also have to be a determinist. Material world is like Newton's clockwork universe, where everything's just a big machine. Scientists imagine that if they knew the state of every particle in the universe, they could compute all the future states from that knowledge. But of course, that's not really true. You have the free will, time, and consciousness, and if that is where you stand in that corner, then materialism and determinism appear to be illusions. There is no determinism. Okay? There is no materialism. Those things just appear to exist. And if you're in the opposite, if you're in the materialism and determinism, then time, consciousness, and free will appear to be illusions. You see, so we have two groups of things that are antithetical to each other logically. If you have one, you can't have the other. Although a lot of scientists and other people pick and choose out of both of those. They do, they're in the materialist camp with the science, and then they also study consciousness and free will, but they don't understand that those things are logically mutually exclusive. the idea that you have determinism and materialism, let's just deal with determinism to begin with. It's not that that is impossible, that this is a deterministic reality. It's that it doesn't make sense. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't create anything. Determinism is a dead thing. It's something that is, always has been, always will be. There's no change, no growth, no evolution, nothing happens. It just is. So it doesn't take you anyplace. There's nothing that you can go from there. It has no purpose, it has no point. It just has nothing. So it's not that it's impossible, it's just that things that don't have any connections to anything else ever, that kind of are all dead-ended, just aren't likely to be that way. It doesn't make any sense, it doesn't lead anywhere. Whereas the free will and time and consciousness, as we know, leads to a lot of things. It leads to this model that I've been telling you about. It leads to an explanation of how our world works. So it does go places, it does change, it can evolve, it can grow. But it's not that determinism and materialism are impossible. It's just that they aren't rational. They don't make sense. All right, so I'm going to try to leave as much room for questions as I can here. I guess I should say one other thing about about applying and using paranormal things, that information about the intent modifying future probability. Everybody can do this. Everybody can use your mind to heal. Everybody can get data out of the databases. It's part of what you can do as a consciousness, but it does require some special practice, I guess I should say, some special ways of being. One of the things that's required is that your mind be in a low noise state. You don't have jabber going on in your mind. Your focus is very clear, very clean, and very precise. That is a difficult thing for most people to do. The way we train ourselves to do that is by meditating. Meditation is basically a training in getting your intellect to sit down and be quiet. So you can just exist, you can just be. When you do that, you disconnect from your sense data and exist as a point of consciousness floating in a black void, because you see nothing, hear nothing, feel nothing. All you are is awareness that you exist. Okay, that is a good meditation state. That may take you years to do that, to get in that spot and to be able to hold it for as long as you like. But that is kind of the gateway to everything else. If you can get to the point consciousness state, everything else will follow. So that's one thing. You need to get rid of the noise in your mind, which requires clarity and focus. Your mind, when you do get data from these databases, you need to be very clear exactly what you want, and just as important, why you want it. This is a consciousness system. The system is conscious, it's aware. You are its strategy for evolving. It's not going to want to go out of its way to help you de-evolve. That's counterproductive. So you're dealing with an aware system. The power that you can put into, say, retrieving data or healing or any of these things is much greater if it comes from your being level. It's almost non-existent if it comes from your intellect. So the intellect makes wishes, but wishes don't move probability. Wishes don't heal. Wishes don't gather data. You have to work from your being level. Okay, now what is that? Being level is different than the intellectual level. Being level is you at your core. Another thing that's at your being level are all your emotions. So you don't think about emotions, they just happen. It's outside of your intellect. If somebody does something to make you angry, you don't look at that, whatever it was, let's say they insulted you. You don't look at the insult and say, oh, that insult should make me angry. I think I'll get angry now. You know, we don't act that way. Anger just boils up out of us instantly without any thought or direction from our intellect. That anger is at the being level. So that's where you need to have this caring, cooperation, and love. That's where you need to have this clarity and focus, is at your being level. Most people's being level is in a constant turmoil of emotion and issues and lack of clarity, which is what makes it difficult for people to access these paranormal things anytime they want to. Now, a bigger picture look at the paranormal is that it's not important. You don't have to ever do anything paranormal to grow up and become love, which is what you're supposed to be doing here. So your success at growing up does not depend on anything paranormal. You can do that just by getting rid of your fear. Your fear creates ego. Your fear creates beliefs. That ego and beliefs manifest or kind of work from your intellect. So your intellect is polluted by your fear. Your being level just is. It also has your fear there too, but it just is. So if you want to practice these paranormal things, learn how to do them and get very good at them, you have to do it from the being level. Being level is a hard concept to tell people, particularly right-brain people left-brain people who live out of their heads, live out of their intellects. Another way of talking about the being level is to say that you're in the zone. You're not working from the intellect. Even something like typing on a typewriter, if you think about where each letter is and then make a mental effort to move your finger to that spot, you'll be a terrible typist. You have to let it go. You have to let the fingers and the eyes and the brain take over and get your intellect to let it go. Otherwise, you can't do it. Well, you type at the being level. If you're an athlete, and if you're a really good athlete, you have to do your sport at the being level. You can't be thinking about, should I do this now? Should I do that? Is it time to kick the ball? You know, is it time to whatever? All that has to just happen. It has to go down to more of an instinctual level, to where it's just part of you. It's the way you are. If you have to think about it, you'll never be very good at it. That's true with almost everything. I've seen painters at my house painting on a window, and they take the brush and it just looks like very casual, you know, they slop it in the paint and they tap it and they go up and they draw this perfect line right down the edge of a window glass, never get a drop on the glass. I couldn't do that, but they're in that zone and they're not intellectually connected to it. They're just functioning. If they tried intellectually to not get a drop on the glass, they'd probably make a terrible mess. So I'm trying to give you some examples of what being level means. Being level is as opposed to the intellectual level. It's the core of you. It's who you really are. So if you work from the being level, you'll have a lot more power. But the being level is one of those places that's hard to work from. Easy to work from the intellect, but the intellect is pretty much powerless. Once you get rid of your fear, your intellect and your being level become one thing. You can think at the being level, you can do analysis at the being level, but it's not the way most of us operate. So as you get rid of the fear, you get rid of the ego, you get rid of the beliefs, then you become just one thing. You become aware of all of you. You don't have a subconscious any longer. It's not like you're the superego, the ego, the subconscious and the id and all of that. All these pieces of you become just one thing, and you're aware of all of it all the time. So at that point, you become authentic. Being authentic means you exist out of your being level. If you exist out of your intellect, you're basically working out of an image, who you'd like to be, who you think you are, not necessarily who you are. So that's hoping to get the idea of being level across to you. So all of the paranormal things work much more powerfully from the being level. And the way you get that being level kind of able to do what you want it to do, because it's kind of a wild and woolly place. It kind of does whatever it wants to do whenever it wants to do it. The way you tame that is by getting rid of your fear. It's the fear that makes that a wild and woolly place. So if you've got this untamed being level that you can't focus, then that is your job, that's your task if you want to deal in the paranormal. But again, you don't need to ever do or experience anything paranormal in order to grow up. But doing things paranormal is a good exercise in getting rid of your ego, having a bigger picture, gaining humility. As you evolve down that course, it is a growing process. So you can use that as a tool to grow up, but it's not necessary. All right, I want to jump into some questions.
Tom, the question is this. If we are immortal consciousness and we're using our bodies as avatars, then there is death, avatar is dead, doesn't function, and we move, quote, to the consciousness back. How is it possible that we can physically interact with our people, close people, the family, on physical items, in physical way, like turning on the radio or doing this and that, etc. So like being in consciousness, how is it possible that we can physically interact with the avatars of our closest people?
In general, most of the time, most people do not interact with the physical, but it can take place that they do. It's possible. Remember, the physical world is a virtual world, and everything that happens there is described by data, in a data stream to that individual. Bob Monroe, one of his experiments was he pinched someone while he was out of body. He came down to where this person was with their body and he pinched them. And indeed, when he called them up and said, "Did you feel that?" Yes, they did, and they had a bruise. So he was able to affect the physical. But most of the time, he didn't. Most of the time, the physical just didn't interact with him. You can just go through walls, you can go up through the ceiling, you can fly under the ocean. The physical world doesn't interact with you. Okay, how is it that he could do it that one time where he interacted? That's because he was doing this experiment to see if he could do it, and the system cooperated with him to let him have that evidence, that data, because he was trying to prove to himself that it was real, that what he was experiencing was a real thing. So if the system puts that data of that bruise and that ouch, into the data system, then that's what that person experiences. So it's only in with cooperation with the system that you can do that. And it's almost always done for the benefit of the person experiencing it. So if your radio turns on or something happens, the reason for that is to help wake you up and give you information that this reality is bigger and stranger than you thought. So it's kind of a way the system helps wake people up to growing up by supporting things like that being done. So that's how it works. It's the system just puts that data in the database to support that effort. And it'll do that whenever it thinks that the end result will be a reduction in entropy in the system.
It was just a comment that these interactions of people who have died to the person, they were not expected, but they appeared and they were very physical. So that was not a question, that was just a comment or confirmation.
Yes, it is very physical. There's nothing more real than information. Information is real. So when that information comes in the database that you've been pinched, you've been pinched. That's how you interpret it. That's how your avatar experiences it. Yeah, you pick the people though.
Hi, my name is Tracy. My question is, did you have an experience in which you have connected with the bigger collective consciousness? And if so, can you describe it?
Yes, one of the things that anyone can do when they can get into the larger conscious system is experience that system. Just experience what the larger conscious system is. And it's a common thing to experience. And it can be experienced many different ways, but I'll just give you the kind of the typical way that goes. And yes, I've experienced this many times and in many ways. You can do it whenever you want to. It's a very wonderful experience. And you start out just by wanting to connect, to be, to experience consciousness. What is it? What is the system? And if that, with that in your intent, you can make that connection. And when you do, you will find yourself to be one with everything. You will find yourself to be connected to everything, everywhere. You'll be connected to every blade of grass, every leaf on a tree, every person, and you feel this complete connectedness, love, belonging. You are it, it's you, it's a oneness, and that feeling is a very strong feeling. It's not in your intellect, it's a much deeper feeling than that. And most people, after they experience that for the first time, can't talk about it for a half an hour later before they can even speak. Often it's life-changing. It lets people know that the larger reality is love and that you are it and it is you. You're a piece of it. It's one of these peak experiences. Sometimes people have that experience when they have near-death experiences, NDEs. Sometimes they have it in meditation. Sometimes the yogis just go there and hang out in that state, and you see them sitting there with their legs crossed and big grins on their face. They experience that, but it's really an experience that everybody should have because it opens your mind and opens your heart all at the same time. to being one with everything and everybody. That's one of the attributes of consciousness, is that all consciousness is netted. So every conscious entity is netted. Just like we're all netted on the World Wide Web, you can click on a URL and get anybody there. Well, it's just like that with consciousness. You can connect with people. You can communicate telepathically. You can experience everyone all at once. It's overwhelming, but it's beautiful at the same time. So yes, it's a very, when I do my immersives, where I try to help people learn how to experience the larger consciousness system, there's almost always 2 or 3 people that will have that experience in the immersive. So there's literally hundreds of thousands of people who've experienced that. It's not that rare, but it's a life changer. You look like you've had that experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Recently.
Yeah. Yeah, it lets you know really what it's all about. Yes.
The question about love. Is it a universal state, firstly? Secondly, why there are so many interpretations and meanings of that word, love? And the third one, is it possible only for a few, or is it available for everybody?
And the first one was, is it reversible?
If it is a universal.
Universal.
Universal state.
Yeah. Yes, love is something that anybody and everybody can experience. Love is something you give away. You have to earn trust, you have to earn like. For somebody to like you, you have to earn that. But love is not earned. Love is a gift you give. It only takes one to love. Now, there are so many expressions of love because mostly we're confused about what love is. Most people who fall in love really fall in need. They find someone that meets their needs, and they meet that other person's needs, and we call that falling in love. All love is unconditional. If it's not unconditional, it's not love. It's a deal, it's an arrangement, it's I'll do this for you if you do that for me kind of a thing. So all love is unconditional. Yes, there's various kinds of love, but they're all the same sort of thing. You know, the brotherly love, the love you have for your children, the love you have for your spouse, the love you have for your lover. All of these are really the same thing. It's a gift of giving. Love is about other. Fear is about self. So that is another characteristic. If it's truly about other, it's unconditional. If it's conditional, that's about self. The conditions are there for you, for your own safety or because of your fear. So that's the nature of love. And yes, love is the nature of a low entropy consciousness. So that is probably the only technical definition you'll ever hear of love. It's the nature of a low entropy consciousness. When we get rid of all our fear, what's left is love. So it's not that you have to go out and learn to love. What you have to do is learn to get rid of your fear. When the fear is gone, you are love.
An experience, out-of-body experience, was shared, and the concept that you can go out of body only mentally, and then you can't pinch anybody, but you can also get out of body like more complete, that you can pinch and then there is a bruise, there is a. So how could you comment on this?
No, this is different. He said that he went out of the body on the level of etheric body. He said etheric body, and then he asked. He said then he went out of the mental body, and he asked about this different went out. Okay.
Yes, out of body can happen in many different ways. It can be, you can drift out of your body and turn around and look at yourself lying in bed. That's kind of a classical out of body, but you don't have to do that. You can be out of body in around this virtual reality, so you interact with the virtual reality, but you don't have to do that. You can be in realities that are have nothing to do with this virtual reality. There's lots of different ways of going out of body. The etheric and the mental and the spiritual are all different, basically different attitudes, different intents that you have. You have an intention to do and explore certain things, and that intention will lead you to have different experience. So if your intention is to be in the astral, or to be in the etheric, or to be in the mental, these are all terms. If you're not familiar with these terms, they come out of Hindu and Buddhist theology, but they're just different perspectives and different intents. It's just like seeing auras. You can see the etheric, you can see a health aura, you can see an emotional aura, where the auras give you information about that person's health or about their emotional state, or you can look at their intellectual state, you can look at their spiritual state. And the way you see those different auras is just by having an intent to gather different information. And when you're going out of body, you also have an intent of what you're doing and where you're going. And if you don't have any intent at all, then it's like you get a random draw. You just go wherever the system thinks you'll learn the most. So that's why you have different things. There's not like an out-of-body place. Remember, an out-of-body is just a different virtual reality. It's not the real reality. It's a different virtual reality. You're still getting a data stream. And the system tends to give you a data stream that is most profitable for your own education, for your own learning and growth. So you tend to see the things you need to see in order to help you grow up. But every reality you are in, every experiential reality, a reality in which you can experience, they're all virtual realities. The only reality that's fundamental is consciousness itself.
My question is about the being level. So I understand how you can function from the being level with activities like sports or playing music. And all meditative spiritual traditions are against thinking. But I wonder how can a being level work? How can you work from the being level on a very intellectual activities? Can you think from the being level? And what is the relation between thinking and the being level?
Okay. You can think at the being level, but when you do, you are not judging, you're not comparing, you are maybe here's another way to help you get it. I define ego as awareness in the service of fear. Okay. If you don't have the fear, then you have awareness in the service of love. When you have awareness in the service of love, that awareness can think. It is, it has cognitive function, and that's what the cognitive function at the being level is. So the ego element, the belief, the fear element is gone. So you can think, You can order, you can direct. I'd like to do this, I'd like to do that, I'd like to collect this data. But what you don't do is the things that are basically fear and ego and belief-based, which is where you're judging and comparing and so on come in. So it's hard to give you a precise answer, but your cognition of thinking from the being level is one of direction, not so much one of analyzing the capital I as integrated with other things. It's not so much an I thing. It's just a direction. I know that wasn't a very good answer, but it's a hard thing to explain. It's one of those things you have to experience.
Po pierwsze chciałabym powiedzieć Tom, I love you. Moje pytanie dotyczy postaci Jezusa. Oczywiście zupełnie pozareligijne interpretacje mnie interesują.
The question was about Jesus. And the first question is, how could you interpret rising from death of Jesus? Jakie była druga część pytania? And if there is any parallel with out-of-body experience, like what Jesus did, that he died and he rose from death, and out-of-body experience. Is it any connection, any similarities? How would you interpret this Jesus rising from death?
The question is, how is that possible? How does that work? Well, this is a virtual reality. In a virtual reality, it is very, very general. Virtual realities, anything can happen. In a virtual reality, anything that can be put in the data stream can happen. So it's not, the physical world doesn't hold sway. Consciousness is fundamental. The physical world is not. So if this was let's just take it at an accepted level and say that this is actual rather than metaphorical, then it's not hard for the system to have that happen just because it helps other people wake up and grow up. The system does all kinds of things to help people wake up and grow up. Sometimes your radio turns on. Sometimes you get a telephone call from your dead mother. Sometimes you see a spaceship land in your yard. There's all sorts of things. Sometimes you see a crop circle. There's lots of things that the system does just to help us wake up. So anything can happen in a virtual reality. It's just, if that gets put into the data stream, it happens. So if it's something that is there as a lesson to create a metaphor for people to help them grow up, then the system can make it happen. So that's how things like that are like that. Now, whether things are, maybe talk about metaphor for a minute. Most everything you get is metaphorical. All the information you get tends to be metaphorical, not necessarily literal. The same with your dreams. When you're in a dream state, most all the information you get is metaphorical. That's because in telepathy, getting information just to your consciousness, telepathy generally doesn't come in letters that make words, that make sentences. It comes in meaning. It comes in a whole chunk of content. You get a paragraph or even a chapter all at once. Boom, you've got it, you understand it. And that is done in terms of metaphors, not done in terms of literal sticking letters together in an alphabet. So that's kind of the way you communicate. So most all of the things that you receive are metaphorical. And much of what happens is metaphorical. It's there for what it does to you, for what you can learn from it. Okay? It doesn't necessarily mean that everything is literal. Matter of fact, to help answer this other person's question too, when you're in your dreams, you work exclusively from your being level when you're in your dreams. So when you're in your dreams, you're authentic. The choices you make, the things you do and say, that's you. When you're here, you tend to work from your intellect and you live your image. Unless you're authentic, then you live out of your being level. So when you're in your dreams, you can think. That's thinking from the being level. So the thing with the death and ascension of Christ, it's better to think of that in terms of metaphors and not get wound up around the literalness of it. Because generally the system gives us information in terms of metaphors that we can use to grow up.
The first question is, you were talking about the metaphors. The question is, where is the science? Is metaphors the science? How science does that explain? Firstly, and secondly, okay, and previously you were saying about your out-of-body experience when you went out of the body and you saw the headlines of the newspapers like 2-3 weeks ahead, and then like, all that happened. How you as a scientist can explain this? Where is the science?
Okay.
So Dr. Kumashne?
Okay. Well, there is a, the study of consciousness is a science itself. Consciousness can be understood. It's just subjective science rather than objective science. But where's the science in terms of the metaphor? That was the first question. And that's a very good question. Scientists make up stories, make up metaphors, and then they tend to forget that they made it up and they believe that the metaphor is an actuality. For example, any property in science, like let's say an electron, just the existence of an electron. No one ever measures an electron, sees an electron. One only sees the effects of an electron, only its effects. So it does affect things. We see effects and we make up the electron to make a reason for the effects. But the electron is just made up. It's really a metaphor. So if we look at basic science, we'll see that that's true of all things in this objective reality. We only can measure effects, not the thing in itself. The thing in itself is typically a metaphor that we have made up to explain the effect. That's why we get into trouble with things like electrons. We think they're little chunks of matter with charge. Then we do quantum mechanics experiments and that doesn't work anymore. That's because we just made that up in the first place because it seemed to answer the effect. The Millikan oil drop experiment, where you get electrons on little oil drops and let them put an electric field across it, and the oil drops will stop going down and start going up. And this is how they first come up with an electron as a unit of charge. Well, that's an effect, and the electron is a metaphor to explain that effect. So that's the thing with metaphors and physics or the physical world, is that the physical world isn't any different, really. And all of the basic things in physics are things that are unknown. Everything fundamental in physics is an unknown. Time. What is time? Where does time come from? Space. What's space? You know, where does that come? Why do electrons have spin? We know they're not really spinning. That's not what's going on. That's a metaphor for an effect. Mass, where does mass come from? See, it just is. So you have all the fundamentals of our physical world have no cause. They just are. There is no cause for mass or for spin or for time or for space. Those things are called fundamental things that just exist because they do. That's science. Science at its root is as mystical as almost anything else. It has its own belief system. So how can I go out of body into the future and deal with that as a scientist? Well, because consciousness allows me to interrogate a future probable database, and that future probable database is a necessary construct to make the virtual reality work. And I don't always get it right because it's only a probable future. It's not the future. So sometimes you don't get it right. It depends on how volatile, say, the news is that week. If the news is very volatile and things happen, then that changes everything, and what you got just isn't right anymore. But you get it right sometimes. And to actually read a headline 2 weeks before it is written word for word, that's enough. You don't have to get it right all the time. If you get it right once, you've made your point that it can be done, even if you can't do it because it's just probable. So it is science. When you understand the science of consciousness, the science of the subjective, then you can explain a lot of things, but they're all subjective. Most of our experience, all of our experience is subjective. Matter of fact, science, the physical world, is a subset of that subjective world. There is really no thing that's objective. Everything has error. Everything has some uncertainty around it. How long or how wide is this lectern? Measure it from here to here. How big is that? Well, it depends on the measuring tool. And eventually you'll get to a measurement that's to 15 decimal places, but it's still plus or minus an error. There's always uncertainty with everything. So the certain world, the objective world, it's only approximately objective. And the physical world of hard science is a subset of the larger non-objective world where the uncertainties are small. So if you're in the subset of things in the subjective world where the uncertainties are small, we call that the objective world. It's only approximately objective. So everything really is a part of the subjective world. How long this thing is really a guess when you get down to measuring it. If you want enough decimal places, now we always round that up and to the nearest half inch or something, but that's not accurate. There is no accurate answer. It doesn't exist because it's not really objective. There's only approximate answers. And those answers that have small probability are called physical and objective. Where they have larger probability, then they're not physical. That's what separates the soft science from the hard science. The hard science is all about things that have small uncertainties, and the soft science is about things that have bigger uncertainties. Can't be nailed down. You need statistics to deal with it. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but it's my best shot.
Proszę Państwa, i to okularnie, który zauważył,